life as an analyst because I was looking at two foreign countries fighting each other. And the moment we started Operation Earnest Will, where the U.S. Navy came in and started escorting tankers, work just got so much more difficult because we were involved, and you started to get involved in where you couldn't just say things about the Iranian Navy or the Iraqi Air Force without having someone at the Pentagon coming and claiming you're starting to get into net assessment because you're making claims about how capable these systems are. And since we don't know U.S. systems at CIA, how can we make claims about these foreign systems? So once the U.S. gets involved, it becomes much more difficult for us in that regard.
Okay. Joe, do you have any comments?
Yeah. David's note about opening space for political freedom, is that the correct phrase? No,
or a political process. I mean, just some kind of peaceful indigenous process.
I didn't know you were such a neocon. I didn't.
If I could
All right, now, all right. As a chairman, okay.
I think it's a valid purpose for political activity and for the United States to engage in the effort of, and our allies to engage in the effort to open political space for, I would say, for human freedom, for freedom of individual persons. I think in the case of Libya, there is a case to be made that it is a just action. I think there's a case to be made that it's not a just action. It hinges on the motives of the leaders who are involved and what their purposes are. I think those are widely varying. I think President Sarkozy has one view of what we're doing in Libya. President Obama has a very different view of what we're doing in Libya, and people are coalescing around those. I do think it raises a couple of, the situation raises a couple of questions. One is, what that really seems to me to call for is regime change. If that's going to be the justification, I should say, because I don't think you're going to get political space in Libya under the Gaddafi regime. Now, you may constrain the areas in which the Gaddafi regime exercises sovereignty and create space outside of those, but that's a form of regime change. You're just changing the space in which he's allowed to operate. So I think at the end of the day, if you're going to make that kind of an argument, then what you're arguing for is regime change, and I think we have to think about that pretty carefully. What I am struck by in the case of what we're dealing with now and what the White House, I think, is struggling to deal with, what the UK, Prime Minister Cameron, Sarkozy are all struggling to deal with, is that we face in the Middle East, in the Arab world, a situation which is comparable, I think, to 1989 in Europe. The strategic ramifications and the potential for a real change in how a lot of individual human persons live is just enormous. And the potential outcome there, in other words, the potential gain is so large that the means we are potentially justified in employing seem to me quite large. The arguments against that are all prudential in the contemporary sense. We don't know what the consequences will be in any individual country. I may have missed the memo, but I still don't know really who the Libyan rebels are. There's some former al-Qaeda. There are some people who genuinely believe in a freer form of government, but it's a mix that I don't fully understand at all. I don't think we know what would replace a Gaddafi regime. Were we to change it, the changing would be fine. What would replace it would be the difficult problem, and that's true across the region as well. And so I think we just got a lot of thinking to do, and I'm not sure we have. Well,
let's do some of that thinking right now, and in terms of the. Start with this gentleman here, and then we'll go to this gentleman over there.
Thank you very much. Great panel. My name is Hendrik Suss. I'm the editor of Journal of Military Ethics. I'll take the opportunity on behalf of Martin Cook and myself to say Jamie is right over there in terms of some leaflets there and some copies you can leaf through if you want to. And obviously a lot of people here who are not already familiar with the journal would be very welcome to submit or read. Now, David, quick question from a philosopher to a philosopher. I think you're self-defeating sort of tack when it comes to the doctrine of prevention, namely that if you show manifest intent and preparation, you are already yourself violating what you say is wrong. And you are saying the only way out of that is a difference between contingency and non-contingency. If you are doing it because the other party is doing it first, that could be the way out of it. Now, the more commonsensical way out of that would be to say that there's a difference between the sorts of intentions and the sorts of causes, just cause and right intention in the just war language, in the sense that the person or party preparing to use force preventively because they want to stop genocide would be different from the party that wants to use force preventively that any party will believe that it does what is right is because it somehow messes up the philosophical argument, because commonsensically it would seem that that would be the crucial difference between right and wrong use of preventive force, what your actual intention is, and I guess you could say what the justice calls for.
Sir.
No, great. So, I mean, obviously, that's going to be incredibly relevant, right? So, if the intention and the preparation is directed towards something like genocide, that's going to be critically different to something like the Bush Doctrine, which is a preparation for engaging in a military intervention in another state. That's clearly right. But I guess the cases that I'm interested in, the cases that that seem to be most relevant, are exactly cases where it looks like there's a kind of a rough symmetry in terms of the objective that's being planned on both sides, right? So we have this kind of this conditional intent to engage in preemptive action, potentially against a state like Iran. Iran isn't planning to engage in a genocidal attack against the United States. Let's put some questions of Israel aside for just a minute. But argue that does engage that. But I mean, a lot of Iran's desire to get nuclear weapons, a lot of their action is presumably very defensive in its own right. So they're seeking to act in ways or put in place conditions for their own security, which is I take it not a fundamentally different form of moral goal to the kind of security-based goals that we have.
Gentleman over here in the red tie.
Yeah, David, the same a variation on the same theme. Supporting comment that Mr. Wood made at the end of this response, and this is on the question of contingent versus non-contingent, which I think, as you can see, dissolves the paradox. That dissolves it. If you can distinguish between these two forms, that dissolves the paradox. And your objection to the dissolution, but the paradox is that there are epistemic problems with it, but I think here, sometimes philosophers, and I'm like you, you're a genuine philosopher, I'm a self-appointed. We sometimes are guilty of decontextual, actually, I would put differently, of ignoring or not paying attention to social theory. So there is a theory out there that actually may help normal, impartial observers to actually determine the intention. Again, it's a theme, I'm reinforcing a theme that Mr. Wood, issue that the point that Mr. Wood made. For example, democratic peace theory predicts that rights respecting democracies will use force, prepare for force continuity. And it also predicts that the opposite of authoritarian regimes or non-liberal or non-democratic, whatever you call it, non-rights respecting, will very often prepare for war non-contingent, offensive, right? So therefore, there you have a theory. Now, you might think that democratic peace theory is not reliable theory, but if it is, I mean, it might be something, and the literature is pretty extensive to give all kinds of reasons for these predictions, right?
Could you bring it to a question?
I'm sorry?
Could you bring it to a question, sir?
Yeah, the question, I already asked the question. The question is, what do you make of social theory that would actually help you predict the intentions?
Right. So, I mean, democratic peace theory seems to work to the extent that democracies don't tend to go to war with each other, but they are incredibly bellicose when it comes to non-democracies. So if you look at the table of states that have gone to war most in the 20th century, the two states at the top of that table, by an enormous margin, are the United States and the United Kingdom, and France is very close up there as well. So I think that there are a lot of benefits that democracies have over non-democracies, including normative and epistemological benefits. But I think it's very difficult to read off from that that they will be better in terms of the way that they think about the use of force particularly against non-democracies. I mean, just to come to your specific question, I think that the distinction between contingent and non-contingent does solve it, probably at a conceptual level. My worries are, at the practical level in terms of applying that in the rule. I think it also, in most cases, will only solve it in terms of establishing liability for a very, very narrow class of objects of force, those that are at the very, very high end of the political and military echelon. I think that for the majority of ordinary soldiers, who are the people who are going to bear the brunt of the action, it's quite hard to make that solution work for them, at least.
We'll go to Dr. Elstein, our distinguished keynote speaker.
This takes things in other directions.
That's
right?
fine.
Is that okay? One of the concerns that I have listening to this has to do with how the notion of innocence is being used, whether it applies to non-combatants or to combatants. And it's my general understanding that when we speak of the innocent in the context of just war, that we're not referring to some putative moral innocence in any absolute sense, but to the fact that there are some people who are they're helpless, they're vulnerable, they have no capacity to defend themselves. And that's why we include all non-combatants in the category of innocent. So that, for example, if someone looking back at the history of World War II makes an argument against the bombing of German cities, the argument would be, I'm opposed to targeting civilians, period. And you don't say, well, unfortunately, when we did that, we killed X number of people who actually opposed the Hitler regime. So what happens when you start to weaken that notion of innocence and start to think more in the language of, who does or doesn't support a certain action? And this presumably could be extended to combatants as well, because we know that there are some combatants in given situations who may be involved in a military action that they actually disagree with. But as combatants, they're part of the chain of command and they're obliged to follow orders. So that's sort of one cluster of concerns. The other, extending from that or being drawn out from that, has to do with imagining, let's say, that you have a situation where one side in a particular conflict claims justice. They have the just cause. The other side has no just cause. Therefore, the combatants on the other side are not deserving of the same sorts of moral rights of combatants historically, so to speak, because they're fighting for a completely unjust cause. Are you not concerned about what that means as far as the brutality of the battlefield, the treatment of prisoners, and all the rest? Well, there's more, but let me just stop right there.
Okay. Steve? Steve as well as David? Steve, you have? Oh. David, I'll turn it over to you.
It's really
Okay.
Sure. So these are all, incredibly important and profound questions. So just really, really briefly, it seems to me that if we take the idea of rights seriously, then a necessary condition for being liable to be targeted is that you have some kind of at least minimal responsibility for an unjust, very significant unjust threat on someone else. I don't think that that means you need to be guilty, because you can imagine situations like, if somebody was attacking you because the mafia had captured your family, their family, and were threatening them, you would have an excuse in law under duress. So you wouldn't be held criminally responsible for the attack. But nonetheless, it seems that you're entitled to kill that person to defend yourself, because he is responsible for the unjust threat, at least minimally responsible for the unjust threat that he's posing towards you. So it seems to me that having that kind of minimal responsibility for an unjust threat is an absolutely baseline necessary condition for being liable to the use of force. And that's why I think that if it's really true that you are a combatant fighting a proper and appropriate defensive war within all of the boundaries of jus in bello, it seems to me I can't understand how that person can be a proper target for attack. They're an ordinary rights-bearing person. Now, does that mean that having that kind of minimal responsibility for imposing an unjust threat on someone else is a sufficient condition for being targeted? Here I'm much less clear. Some people have argued that. Some of Jeff McMahon's arguments have suggested conclusions in that direction. I'm not so sure. It seems to me that there are cases where we might want to say that although it's a necessary condition to have that kind of responsibility, it's not sufficient, and that it only becomes sufficient in the context of some kind of present aggression. So to take the mafia example a little bit further, let's say that the mafia people who'd done this induction and were forcing you to threaten me were also sustained by certain people in their community, by their family. Does that mean that you could kill the family and the community members just because they sustain and give succor to those mafia bosses? Probably not, right? Although in some sense they're responsible for the action of the mafia boss.